All right, everybody, welcome to the show. I am jam-packed for you today. Got a lot of stuff to talk about. So the Inflation Reduction Act has now passed the Senate. It now goes to the House. I'm going to give you all the specifics of that, tell you what provisions made it in the bill and what provisions were axed. Is it a good piece of legislation or not? We're going to hit every single angle of this. I also have Bernie Sanders during the Votorama segment of the debate, which is a real thing, by the way. I'm not making up that term. It's been used by the media time and time again. Other Democratic senators going after him because he had the audacity to try to put good provisions back in the bill. And then we have Alex Jones responds to the verdict where he has to pay, I believe the number is $49.2 or $49.3 million in damages to the families of the Sandy Hook victims because of the defamation. So we'll talk about that. Man, if anybody was holding out hope that, perhaps Alex will learn a lesson now and he'll, reel it in a little bit. No, not even close to what's happening. Then we also had CPAC. Trump and Cruz gave speeches, as expected, massively deranged. And the one and only Darth Cheney himself came out and did a campaign ad video for Liz Cheney, his daughter, and he breaks out the whooping stick for Donald Trump, so I have many thoughts about that. Anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. So this is an NPR article here. They say Democrats passed a major climate, health, and tax bill. Here's what's in it. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a second and give you the overview in a second, but I actually want to start with what's not in the bill. So Bernie Sanders spoke about this recently, or wrote a piece about this recently. This is in Business Insider. Bernie Sanders knocked Schumer and Manchin's big climate and healthcare bill, calling it the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Here we go. Senator Bernie Sanders blasted Democrats' massive climate and healthcare bill on Saturday evening as senators tried to pass a major piece of Biden's economic agenda after more than a year of debate. Quote, I want to take a moment to say a few words about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that we are debating this evening, Sanders said just after joining Democrats in advancing debate on the proposal. I say so-called because according to the CBO and other economic organizations that have studied this bill, it will in fact have a minimal impact on inflation. For much of the week, Sanders has torn into the $740 billion proposal brokered by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Joe Manchin, which would invest millions in green energy, lower some prescription drug prices, by the way, key word there, some prescription drug prices, and impose a 15% minimum tax on large corporations. Sanders' mention of the CBO, or Congressional Budget Office, is a nod to the nonpartisan scorekeepers' finding that the proposal is negligible, at least in the immediate future, and that's as it pertains to inflation, NPR previously reported. The Vermont Independent intends to introduce amendments to change the bill, so this already happened, but this article came out just before the Votorama portion, such as one measure that would empower Medicare to pay an amount equal to the Department of Veterans Affairs for prescription drugs. So in other words, that's Bernie saying, okay, if we're going to lower some prescription drug prices, let's lower all prescription drug prices, and let's do the very straightforward thing of whatever the VA negotiates with the pharmaceutical companies, let's have that be the price for the drugs, period. So that's something that he proposed. Now, you're not going to be surprised to learn it didn't make it in the bill. Okay, I believe the only other senators who voted with Bernie were Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. Sanders later stood alone as both Democrats and Republicans rejected his amendment to cap costs for covered prescription drugs under Medicare Part B and D by a 99-1 vote. Okay, so they say it was 99-1 on that portion, but then they say both Georgia Democrats, Senators Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff, later joined Sanders on an amendment that would require Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing benefits. But once again, the Vermont senators' effort failed via a lopsided vote, this time 3-97. So this is virtually everybody else in the Senate voting down these common sense proposals, which, by the way, every single Democrat at one point or another has said, oh, I support this. In fact, a lot of them, when they voted against it, gave speeches saying, just so everybody knows, I support this, but I'm going to vote against it. What? A third Sanders amendment to create a civilian climate corps also failed to garner any additional votes in favor. Republicans have used the CBO's findings as fodder to lambaste the Democrats' proposal. Some have previously used Sanders' exact approach of referring to the proposal as the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Quote, I don't find myself saying this very often, but on that point, I agree with Bernie. Senator John Thune of South Dakota, the second-ranked Senate Republican, told Insider, Sanders has fumed over the elements that were jettisoned from Biden's larger Build Back Better agenda to advance the compromise. So here are other things Bernie brought up for amendments to this bill. Universal pre-K, tuition-free community college, and in-home care for the elderly, so elder care. Now, again, I want to be clear about something. These are all proposals that at one point or another, every single Democrat in the Senate said, I support this. So Bernie's response to that was, oh, you do? Okay, well, I'll take you at your word, and now I'm going to propose an amendment to this bill, which is the thing that all of you said you support. So now let's see, do you support it? And the response? See, well, I mean, when I said support, it depends on what the definition of the word support is when I say support, because the thing about the stuff and things is that the sun was in my eyes, and me and Craig and them was down by the Safeway, and we didn't even understand what everybody was doing. So they're against the thing that they claim they support, which means they don't support it. They don't support it. The Vermont senator and former presidential candidate added the legislation contains good features, but also criticized its inclusion of a drug pricing provision that will take years to kick in. He later called it an incredibly tepid bill. Sanders also ripped the provisions in the bill that would expand some fossil fuel exploration, in addition that helps secure Manchin's support. Okay, so let's stop here, and I want to break it down a little bit for you. So, look, this is an ironclad fact that I think people on the left need to get their minds around. There's literally no way this bill would pass without the fossil fuel provisions. It's just, it's a 0.00% chance at this point. Now, previously, as I've told you guys a million times, I think Build Back Better or a version of Build Back Better could have been passed if Biden was able to put political pressure on Manchin, play the carrot or stick approach. There was a window to do that. That window has now shut. So at this point we are right now, giving the fossil fuel provisions, it's just, I understand why everybody wants it out, but it just wouldn't be possible at all for this bill to pass without that. So on that particular point, I actually disagree with Bernie, because that actually would tank the bill if you took that out. Okay? Now, having said that, Bernie is 100% right when he says, look, I've had conversations with all of you here. And at one point or another, every single one of you has told me you support universal pre-K, you support tuition-free community college, you support elder care, you support an extension of the child tax credit. So if all of you support it, and we're only going to pass this thing with 51 votes, 50 plus Kamala Harris comes in and breaks the tie, well then there's literally no reason for you to vote against this. You can't say, oh, the deal is so fragile, so I can't. You can't do that. Because if all of you said you support these things, okay, then I'm going to put it in the bill. Vote for it. And they didn't. And they didn't. So on that point, Bernie is 100% correct. And he's frustrated because, of course, he negotiated the original Build Back Better deal, which was $3.5 trillion, which had a number of phenomenal provisions in it, which was the biggest transformation of the American economy since the New Deal. That legislation was, if it passed as written, which of course it didn't, because we all know what happened from there. Manchin and Sinema took a hatchet to it and a blowtorch to it, and they destroyed it in 1,000 different ways. However, it did appear like the whole thing was dead skis and we were going to get Dickie McGee's axe. But then at the last minute, Chuck Schumer, oh God, rushes in, saves the day, negotiates a deal with Manchin. And as we're already pointing out, there are provisions of the bill that are not good. But also, as Bernie himself says, yeah, but there are also parts of this that are definitely good. So Bernie did the right thing, getting everybody on the record. Hey, you say you support this, do you? And then they didn't. Okay, so that's their fault, not Bernie's. That's their problem, not Bernie's. He did the right thing here. Now, what actually is in the bill? See, this is important. Let's go through some of the specifics. This is in NPR. Democrats passed a major climate, health, and tax bill. Here's what's in it. Senate Democrats, after weeks of negotiations to revive the core of their election year agenda, passed a spending bill which would attempt to tackle climate change, the high cost of prescription drugs, and lower the deficit by roughly $300 billion. Late Saturday night and into Sunday morning, senators voted on amendments to Democrats' major spending bill that tackles healthcare, climate, and taxes. The legislation was passed through the budget reconciliation process, which means all 50 Democrats and one tiebreak vote from Vice President Kamala Harris were needed, since none of the 50 Republican senators voted for the bill. It also restricts the measures in the bill to those that directly change federal spending and revenue. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said Saturday that despite a few cuts from the Senate parliamentarian, the bill overall is still a legislative win for Democrats. Quote, "It's been a long, tough, winding road," Schumer said before the final vote Sunday. Democrats have argued the measure will tackle voters' main economic concern, naming it the Inflation Reduction Act. Republicans argue the new spending will aggravate inflation. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says, though, the bill has a negligible effect on inflation, at least in 2022 and 2023. I think in the long term, maybe it reduces inflation a little bit. But again, you guys know this. Inflation is largely about the supply chain crisis more than anything else. That's the biggest part of it. And so will this really address the heart of it? I don't know. I think the reason they named the bill that is because if they're going to get Manchin support, he has to have this cover of like, I'm not with the Democrats and I'm not a partisan, so I'm just interested in tackling inflation. And so we named this bill the Inflation is Bad Act. Like, that's the gist of it. It's all politicking, which shouldn't surprise you guys from politicians. All right, so here's what's in the bill. Tackling climate change. More than $300 billion would be invested in energy and climate reform, the largest federal clean energy investment in U.S. history. The bill has support from many environmental and climate activists, but is short of the $555 billion that Democrats had originally called for. Again, that was in the original Build Back Better bill. This portion of the bill takes on transportation and electricity generation, and it includes $60 billion for growing renewable energy infrastructure in manufacturing like solar panels and wind turbines. It also includes several tax credits for individuals on things like electric vehicles and making homes more energy efficient. All those things are great, by the way. The bill would, according to Democrats, lower greenhouse gas emissions by 40% based on 2005 levels by the end of the decade, which is short of the 50% Biden had originally aimed for. Quote, "It puts us within a close enough distance that further executive action, state and local government efforts, and private sector leadership could plausibly get us across the finish line by 2030, said Jesse Jenkins from Princeton University, who leads the REPEAT project analyzing the impact of government climate actions. So let me pause here to say, I don't know if these numbers are true, and this is the Democrats talking about their own bill and giving their own projections, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. However, having said that, no matter what the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is, as a matter of principle, it's good because we're finally taking a step in the right direction. And there are things in this bill that are real as a heart attack that are definitely positive. Lowering the cost of prescription drugs. On health reforms, the bill takes on making prescription drugs more affordable, but there are some limits. The bill includes a historic measure that allows the federal health secretary to negotiate the prices of certain expensive drugs each year for Medicare. So this is where we get to the Weasley, Washington, D.C. nonsense, is that they can't just come out and say, we're going to negotiate for lower prescription drug prices across the board because they're bought by Big Pharma. So it's always this Weasley middle path, which nobody's asking for a compromise on this. The polls on this are crystal clear. Of course, Americans want lower drug prices. But where we ended up is, of course, in a position that does something good, but also massively appeases industry and isn't anywhere near enough. But this won't impact every prescription drug or every patient, and it won't take effect quickly. The negotiations will take effect for 10 drugs covered by Medicare in 2026, increasing to 20 drugs in 2029. I mean, this is comical. By the way, I should add, David Dane of the American Prospect has pointed out, Biden already has the authority to unilaterally, through executive action, lower prescription drug prices. I believe there's two justifications for it legally. One of them is the Bayh-Dole Act. So he already has the authority to do it, and they're choosing to put it into the bill, and they're choosing to water it down. The portion of the bill that tried to cap at $35 per month the price of insulin, a drug that is incredibly expensive in the U.S. compared to other countries, was ruled out of order by the Senate parliamentarian who ruled the cap could apply on Medicare, a government program, but not on private insurance. This is infuriating, and you guys have heard me say this 1,000 times. They need to fire this Senate parliamentarian. Because the Republicans always bring in a parliamentarian who greenlights anything and everything they do, and the Democrats always bring in a parliamentarian who blocks a lot of the things they do. So Democrats split the measure between Medicare and private insurance, but Republicans ultimately blocked the measure for private insurance. Wow. The parliamentarian also ruled that a measure that was in the bill to force drug companies to offer rebates if prescription prices outpaced inflation was not totally in line with the rules for budget reconciliation. She said that it could apply to Medicare patients, but not those with private insurers. The bill puts a cap of $2,000 on out-of-pocket prescription drug costs for people on Medicare, effective in 2025. There's also a 3-year extension on healthcare subsidies in the Affordable Care Act, originally passed in a pandemic relief bill last year, estimated by the government to have kept premiums at $10 per month or lower for the vast majority of people covered through the federal health insurance program. I think it's keep them at increasing $10 a year or less. I think that's what that's supposed to mean there. But that's an important provision. It probably is one of the more underreported aspects of this bill, is that, the extension of the subsidies under Obamacare is super important because it will help limit the increase of how much health insurance costs, and that is a very important issue. Tax reform. The legislation creates a $15% minimum tax for corporations, making $1 billion or more in income, bringing in more than $300 billion in revenue. This is a great provision. A portion that got cut, though, is one that narrowed the carried interest loophole. So I'll explain that in a second. Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema agreed to sign on to the bill if this measure, which would have changed the way private equity income is taxed, was cut. Democrats said it would have brought in $14 billion in revenue. All right, so let me explain the carried interest thing. The carried interest loophole is where people who work in private equity, basically whatever they get paid through their salary, instead of that being taxed as regular income, there's this loophole where they say, that's carried interest. And so they get to pay the capital gains rate, which is a lower rate. So basically, to sum it up, this is about private equity dodging the same taxes that other working people have to pay, and they get to pay a lower rate. So Kyrsten Sinema comes in at the last minute and says, look, I'm not going to vote for the bill if it raises taxes on private equity, or, we need to keep in some loopholes for private equity effectively. So she's going to bat for private equity. That's effectively what happened here. Now, Kyrsten Sinema ended up voting for the bill, and, her demands there were a couple demands on weakening the tax increases on private equity. She also wanted some stuff for Arizona specifically, I think, as it relates to drought resistance. And there was one good thing that Kyrsten Sinema wanted in there, which I think was a 1% tax on stock buybacks. So, that's surprising that she wanted anything along those lines, but keep in mind she did also weaken, the tax increases on private equity. Instead, a 1% excise tax, there you go, on stock buybacks was introduced, and it could bring in roughly 5 times as much revenue as the carried interest measure. However, it wouldn't take effect until next year, raising predictions of a rush of buybacks by some companies before 2023 rolls around. So that's an important caveat, and that's a very good point. But ultimately, they do point out, look, the 1% tax on stock buybacks is actually better than getting rid of the carried interest loophole. Look, as a matter of principle, you should get rid of the carried interest loophole, but it's good that the 1% excise tax on stock buybacks is in there. A major portion of the bill that isn't included, due to opposition from West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, is extending the child tax credit. Now, remember, at one point he said he supports that. Manchin expressed last year that the cost to extend the credit was too high, but progressives, including Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, have continued to push for its inclusion in the bill. Sanders planned to add it as an amendment to the legislation during the all-night voting process. Even with this support, he needs to pass it. Okay, so there you go. Look, this is the breakdown of what's in the bill. There's also, what's the name of it? There's the Progressive Caucus Center, which tracks Congress and specifically, the Progressive Caucus. They released a full breakdown of the bill where you could see every single provision and where, every dollar and cent goes to. And I went through that last night. And suffice to say, there is a lot of stuff in this bill that it's just good. It's just great provisions. It is way better than being caught in Death Valley in no man's land where there's no hope of anything at all passing, which is where we were, by the way, or at least we thought that's where we were. So ultimately, my final conclusion on this is very simple. What Bernie Sanders did was the correct thing to do. It was absolutely necessary. It was, okay, you guys all say you support these provisions, which were axed from Build Back Better. Universal pre-K, elder care, extending the child tax credit, et cetera, et cetera. He had a list of things that at one point or another, every Democrat agreed to. He proposed them as amendments and said, this is our last chance, bro. Let's get this in the bill. Let's get this in the bill right now. And they were rejected. Okay? Bernie did the right thing, bringing that up, trying to get everybody on the record, trying to rally the troops to the right position. Ultimately, that failed. Now, all that's left is this bill right here. I will say this bill on the merits is probably more impressive than anything that the Obama administration did their entire time in office, maybe even including Obamacare. So, I mean, you could argue like the Iran deal, but that's more foreign policy than domestic policy. And it's only foreign policy and not domestic policy. He did some things that I thought were good, normalizing relations with Cuba, the Iran deal, Obamacare, which really should have been at the very least a public option, if not Medicare for all. But, I digress from that point. But this bill is bigger and better, let's say, than 99.9% of things that Obama did, if not 100% of the things that Obama did. So now it goes to the House, and the question is this going to get through the House? My perception of the situation is this. I don't think there's going to be any issues from the Progressive Caucus or from the Squad. I think in the final analysis here, they're going to say, this is a lot better than we thought we'd get. We thought we'd get Donut Dickie McGee's acts at this point. But you have Josh Gottheimer, who's part of the centrist, corporatist establishment wing of the Democratic Party, who does nothing but represent Big Pharma and Wall Street. I don't know if he's part of the New Democrat Coalition or the Problem Solvers Caucus, as they call it, but Josh Gottheimer has what he calls the Unbreakable Nine, I think they're called, which is like all the worst corporate Democrats you can imagine. Now they're going to get their hands on this bill. Now understand, you only need 3 of the Unbreakable Nine to try to block this from getting through, to tank it. So the question is, does Josh Gottheimer want to be the villain of the day? Does Josh Gottheimer or whoever he brings with him from the Unbreakable Nine, do they want to be the villains of the day or the week or the month? Are they going to be able to withstand what is undoubtedly coming, which is extreme media scrutiny and even the leadership of the Democratic Party going after them on this? And it's going to be a tough call for them because on the one hand, their whole point in being in Washington, D.C. is to represent their donors. And their donors, like all the corporations that are going to get their taxes raised here, are not going to want them to do this. So they're going to be caught between, hey, do I listen to my donors and kill the thing? Or do I listen to my donors and weaken the bill more, which is a real possibility? Or is it so politically risky that I know I'm going to lose my seat and I'm pissing off Democratic leadership, which these people never like to do, and so I'll just, sort of suck it up and vote for it. We're going to watch that unfold. I believe the vote is supposed to come up in the House on Friday. But either way, man, it'll be very interesting to see. Because my biggest concern was, I thought Kyrsten Sinema might be an issue. Turns out she only was a little bit. They just needed to weaken this stuff around private equity, which is horrendous, by the way. But I said it on Crystal Kyle and Friends. I think the real issues might arise with Gottheimer and his, gaggle of corporate dem idiots. So we're going to see what happens. But if this passes, by the way, I will say this is another one of the things that will help Democrats in the midterms. I think that's undeniable because we all see what happened with Roe versus Wade and how that unfolded and how elected Republicans are going super extreme. We know that they voted against gay marriage, 157 of them. They voted against a right to contraception, 195 of them. The January 6th committee, agree or disagree with it, it's really effective because it's political theater that's landing and accurately portraying Trump as a dictator wannabe. And I think that's landing with the voting public, which is why now you've seen all those polls shift and now Democrats are actually leading a little bit in the midterm polls. I know it's surprising. Biden is still super unpopular, but the Democrats in the generic ballot are leading in the midterm polls now. And if this passes, I think you're going to see another 3-4 point bump in the Democrats' direction. So we'll see. A lot of stuff happening now. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.